December 24, 1944. Somewhere in rural Texas. Snow drifts quietly over endless fields of cotton and wheat stubble. The wind moves slow, heavy with the scent of pine and smoke. In the distance, a faint light flickers from a wooden farmhouse, a single square of warmth against the frozen plain. Inside, the table is set, plates mismatched but clean. A roast wrapped in brown paper. The farmer's wife adjusts a lantern. Her hands are red from work. Their children whisper by the window, peering toward the barbed wire that glints in the moonlight beyond the barn. Out there, behind the wire, a group of men in faded gray uniforms stand in the cold. German prisoners. Once soldiers in Africa and France, now strangers on American soil. Then the farmhouse door opens. The farmer steps out, his breath clouding in the night air. He walks toward the gate, carrying nothing but an invitation. And for a moment, between war and peace, enemy and host, the camp falls silent. By the winter of 1944, the United States, a country untouched by bombing raids or occupation, had quietly become the world's largest warden of enemy soldiers. Across the Midwest, South and Plains, small towns awoke to the sound of military trucks rumbling down two-lane roads. Behind canvas covers sat men who, only months earlier, had fought under the Iron Cross. They were prisoners of the Third Reich, captured in North Africa, Sicily, Normandy. When the Allies advanced through Tunisia in 1943, tens of thousands of German and Italian troops surrendered in the desert. The British and Americans faced a logistical nightmare. The front lines were moving fast, but prisoners needed feeding, shelter, and guards. The solution was practical, not political. Ship them across the Atlantic. America had space, security, and food. Between 1943 and 1946, more than 425,000 Axis POWs arrived on American shores. They came in waves, from ports in Algeria, Liverpool, and Naples to New York, Boston, and New Orleans. From there, they were scattered inland to over 500 main camps and 900 branch camps, stretching from California's deserts to the pine forests of Louisiana. The largest clusters formed in Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, states with wide farmland, mild winters, and military installations already in place. It was not uncommon to find German-speaking men harvesting corn outside Abilene or building fences near Lubbock. To local Americans, their arrival was surreal. For years, newspapers had portrayed the German soldier as a ruthless ideologue, mechanical, fanatical, inhuman. Yet when the trucks arrived, the men stepping down were young, weary, and polite. Many were barely 20, their uniforms sun-bleached from Africa, their boots cracked by the march from Normandy. The War Department issued strict instructions. The prisoners would be treated according to the Geneva Convention of 1929. They were to receive fair food, medical care, recreation, and the right to send letters home. In return, they would work, not as slaves but as laborers paid in canteen credits or small stipends. This treatment was not born of mercy alone. The U.S. military understood reciprocity. Every German treated well in America meant a better chance for American POWs captured in Europe to receive humane treatment in return. Still, the sight of captured enemies walking unguarded across American farms unsettled many. Farmers who had lost sons in the Pacific now watched German soldiers picking peaches in the same orchards. Churches debated morality. Newspapers printed cautious editorials. Yet the war's manpower crisis left little choice. By 1944, nearly 12 million American men were in uniform, and the harvest could not wait. Thus, POW labor became part of the American home front. In Texas, Oklahoma, and the Carolinas, farmers applied for prisoner labor through local army offices. Groups of 10 to 20 Germans would arrive at dawn in olive-drab trucks, guarded by a single American sergeant. They would work long hours, planting, picking, repairing, and then return to camp before sundown. Most did not resist. In fact, many found relief in the routine. Compared to the front, America was a strange sanctuary. No air raids, no hunger, no constant death. And over time, something unexpected happened. The fear began to fade. Children waved at the trucks. Store owners nodded to the men in line at the worksite. And on some farms, quiet conversations began. Broken English, simple phrases, and gestures that bridged two worlds. For the first time, rural America looked into the eyes of its enemy and saw something human staring back. That humanity, fragile, forbidden, and powerful, would soon lead to moments that history almost forgot. Moments like a farmer's dinner table in Texas, where compassion crossed the wire. The German prisoners called it Das andere Amerika, the other America, a place that was both enemy territory and unexpected refuge. By mid-1944, Hundreds of POW camps dotted the American landscape. Some were vast military compounds housing 5,000 men or more, surrounded by high fences and floodlights. Others were little more than temporary branch sites, clusters of barracks on the edges of farms, factories, or lumber mills, but everywhere, the routine was the same. At sunrise, a bugle sounded. The prisoners formed ranks in the cold, counted by U.S. Army guards. Then came work details, farm crews, sawmill teams, repair units. By evening, they were back behind the wire, where discipline relaxed and a semblance of community began. Under the Geneva Convention, officers were not required to work, but enlisted men could be assigned to labor compatible with military dignity. The War Department, balancing legality with necessity, used them for agriculture, forestry, and light industry, but never in war production. Inside the camps, the U.S. military built small worlds of control and civility. Barracks were lined with cots, wood stoves, and communal washrooms. Meals were adequate, often more generous than rations in war-torn Europe. Prisoners received medical care, mail delivery, and the right to worship. They were even given supplies to create: instruments, art materials, sports gear. In some camps, the Germans built theaters from scrap wood, staged plays, and formed orchestras that performed Beethoven beneath the guard towers. Others produced handwritten newspapers, printing essays on philosophy and politics under pseudonyms. There were also schools, Kriegsgefangenenschulen, where professors among the captured taught mathematics, literature, and even English to fellow inmates. The U.S. government quietly encouraged this education, believing that re-educating prisoners might plant the seeds of democratic thought for post-war Germany. Still, beneath this calm surface lay tension. Among the prisoners were die-hard Nazis, Die Schwarzen, the blacks, who sought to maintain loyalty to the Third Reich. They intimidated moderates, punished dissenters, and secretly displayed Hitler portraits in the barracks. In some camps, ideological clashes turned violent. A handful of murders occurred, German on German, as fanaticism collided with disillusionment. The American guards, often National Guard reservists or older veterans, learned quickly to distinguish between the fervent and the weary. Most treated the prisoners with professionalism, occasionally with quiet sympathy. Few guards were cruel. They didn't need to be. The barbed wire, geography, and ocean did the work for them. Beyond the fences, a different kind of relationship began to grow. Local farmers discovered that the German POWs were efficient, skilled, and surprisingly respectful. Many had been mechanics, students, or craftsmen before the war. They repaired tractors, built irrigation ditches, and harvested crops with precision. Language barriers fell away under the rhythm of work. Children from nearby towns would stand by the road, offering the men apples or cigarettes through the wire. American wives, initially cautious, began leaving water jugs near the fields on hot days. Even so, regulations forbade fraternization. The War Department feared propaganda, escape attempts, or accusations of favoritism, but rules softened as the months passed, especially in smaller branch camps far from scrutiny. The war in Europe was reaching its climax. The Allies advancing across France, the Reich crumbling. The German prisoners knew it. They listened secretly to shortwave radios or read between the lines of Red Cross bulletins. For many, the fight was already over. What remained was survival and dignity. In those months, thousands of Americans and Germans met across the invisible line of war, not in battle, but in fields, barns, and dining halls. They worked side by side, wordlessly acknowledging the absurdity of the conflict that had placed them there. It was within this quiet normalcy that humanity began to flicker again. A handshake, a shared loaf of bread, a song hummed during work. And somewhere in the cold winter of 1944, one farmer, like many, decided to take that fragile connection one step further, to open his home, to invite his prisoners to dinner. For most Americans in 1944, the German existed only in headlines and propaganda reels, faceless, mechanical, dangerous. Yet on the quiet farms of Texas, Iowa, and Georgia, that abstraction suddenly had a human form. When the army trucks rolled in each morning, farmers met men who smiled shyly, removed their caps, and waited for instructions. Many spoke a few words of English. Yes, sir. Work here. Finish soon? Learned from guards or American magazines circulating through the camp. These were not stormtroopers or ideologues. Most were young draftees, sons of farmers, carpenters, or apprentices pulled from rural Germany into a war they could neither stop nor understand. Working side by side, both farmer and prisoner began to notice small similarities. The same calluses on their palms, the same worry for family, the same silent endurance of heat and labor. A distance remained. Fear, suspicion, the invisible wall of war. But over weeks, gestures softened. Some Americans began leaving extra biscuits in lunch pails. A few Germans offered hand-carved trinkets or sketches as thanks. Such exchanges were quiet acts of defiance, not against country, but against hatred itself. The seeds of empathy were taking root in the most unlikely soil, an American field, plowed by both sides of the war. The POW program was more than humane policy. It was a wartime necessity. By 1944, millions of American men had left for Europe and the Pacific, leaving farms, mills, and canneries short of labor. Entire crops risked rotting in the fields. The War Manpower Commission, desperate to sustain the food chain that fed both troops and allies, turned to the one resource suddenly abundant: prisoners of war. Under supervision of the Provost Marshal General's office, German POWs were integrated into civilian labor systems with astonishing efficiency. Paid roughly 80 cents a day in canteen credits, they replaced missing farmhands, harvested cotton, processed lumber, and built rural infrastructure that would last decades. In Texas alone, nearly 70,000 POWs worked the fields during the 1944 season, contributing millions of man-hours to the war economy. American officers often admitted off-record that without them the harvest would have failed, but there was more than pragmatism at play. Every German soldier working peacefully under U.S. command was a symbolic victory, a reversal of power. The same men who had once followed orders under the swastika now labored freely under a democratic system that fed friend and foe alike. It was quiet warfare, measured not in gunfire, but in wheat and cotton bales. Behind every handshake across the wire stood a mountain of regulation. The U.S. War Department maintained strict oversight through the Provost Marshal General's office, which coordinated with the Red Cross and international inspectors. Commanders were repeatedly reminded, discipline must be firm but just. Colonel Kenneth P. Landon, one of the officials overseeing the program, once wrote that humane treatment was the best propaganda America could send back through its prisoners. The logic was strategic, kindness as psychological warfare. Yet at the ground level, leadership meant something quieter. Camp commanders, often career officers weary from frontline duty, found themselves managing thousands of men who no longer wished to fight. Rules were followed, but compassion found its way through the cracks. Guards shared cigarettes. Officers allowed Christmas music to play. Chaplains held bilingual services. Every small leniency, every permitted human comfort reflected the American military's self-image, victorious yet moral. Still, the line was thin. One act of excessive familiarity could invite reprimand. One lapse in security could risk scandal. Thus, most kindnesses remained unofficial, wordless, and fleeting, like an invitation whispered at dusk. The system held together not only through command, but through the quiet understanding that decency, once shown, could not easily be contained, and in one camp, that unspoken understanding would soon take physical form. At a dinner table under a winter sky. For many German soldiers, capture had been expected, but what awaited them in America was not. The voyage across the Atlantic was their first encounter with abundance. On U.S. soil, the reality of American power struck harder than any weapon. Full meals, orderly camps, medical care, electricity, even libraries. The men who had been told by Nazi propaganda that the United States was decadent and collapsing saw instead a nation disciplined, industrious, and free of fear. At Camp Hearn in Texas, POWs watched American townsfolk drive new cars and attend church in peace while Europe burned. In Camp Swift, they saw black and white soldiers working side by side, a sight that left some confused, others reflective. Letters home were censored, yet phrases slipped through. We are treated fairly. There is enough to eat. America is not what we were told. Some prisoners experienced a quiet ideological collapse. The Hitler Youth songs faded. The loyalty salutes became mechanical. Others, especially officers, clung harder to old beliefs, fearing that to admire the enemy was to betray everything they had fought for. But admiration did grow. It was the subtle kind that came from watching Americans speak freely, debate openly, laugh loudly. In the barracks at night, some Germans whispered that perhaps Germany had lost more than the war. It had lost the idea of what freedom could be. And in that recognition, the seeds of post-war reconciliation were already being planted. On both sides of the fence, morality became a battlefield of its own. American guards were instructed to remember your enemy, yet when that enemy smiled, helped mend a fence, or showed a photograph of his children, the line between duty and conscience blurred. A sergeant in Oklahoma wrote home, "I'm supposed to watch them like hawks, but sometimes I forget who's guarding who." The local civilians faced the same conflict. Churches debated whether it was Christian to show compassion to men who had served Hitler. Some ministers condemned it. Others quoted the gospel. "I was a stranger and you took me in." For the prisoners, too, the moral struggle was deep. They carried guilt for what their army had done, for the destruction unleashed upon Europe, for their families left behind. Yet many also carried shame for feeling gratitude toward their captors. To accept kindness from the enemy was a humiliation, but also a relief. Within that contradiction between guilt and grace grew an uneasy peace. Each shared smile, each meal or handshake, became a moral act in defiance of ideology. It was not about forgetting the war, but about remembering that war could not erase humanity. The farmer's invitation would soon embody that very tension, not rebellion against country, but allegiance to conscience. Rural America in the 1940s was deeply traditional, wary of outsiders, proud of sacrifice. Yet through quiet repetition, exposure to the prisoners began to shift perceptions. At first, the German POWs were seen as dangerous, even monstrous. Local rumors spoke of spies, saboteurs, Hitler's men in disguise. But when the first work details began, those fears began to dissolve. The prisoners whistled while working, joked with guards, repaired fences better than anyone expected. They prayed before meals, wrote letters to mothers, carved toys for children. The townsfolk began to see something unsettling. They were normal. By 1944, in some communities, attitudes had transformed entirely. School teachers allowed German prisoners to attend Christmas services. Shopkeepers donated extra bread to the work trucks. Families waved as the columns passed through town. In newspapers, cautious editorials began to appear. "These boys are not the enemy who bombed London," one Texas editor wrote. "They are the sons of farmers like ours." The kindness became contagious. It didn't erase the war, but it softened it. For many Americans, these interactions were their first lesson in empathy across enemy lines. For many Germans, it was their first experience of freedom without fear. By the end of 1944, such human contact was no longer rare, but the act of sharing a table, of breaking bread, still crossed a forbidden threshold. That threshold was about to be tested on a cold Christmas Eve, when one farmer decided to do what no regulation permitted, to open his door to the enemy. The war still raged across Europe. In the Ardennes, the German army was launching its desperate counterattack, the Battle of the Bulge, a final surge of fury before collapse. But in Texas, thousands of miles away, the night was calm. Frost hung on the fence posts. A thin layer of snow shimmered under the moonlight. Unusual even for December, inside the barbed wire compound near a small farming town, Camp Hearn, one of many spread across the plains, the prisoners gathered quietly. They had spent the day loading hay bales and repairing machinery, their thoughts drifting to homes now unreachable. Christmas had always been sacred to them, not in a political sense, but a human one. In Germany, it meant family, candlelight, songs echoing through the cold. Now, behind foreign wire, it meant absence. In the barracks, a group of men improvised a small tree from a branch found during work duty. They hung tin stars made from food cans and wrapped colored paper from Red Cross parcels. Someone played a harmonica. Faint, hesitant, almost embarrassed, the melody was Stille Nacht. A guard heard it and paused at the door. For a brief moment, he didn't shout or silence them. He simply listened, and in the faint glow of the searchlights, even the watchtower seemed still. Just beyond the camp's perimeter, a nearby farmer finished his own chores. His fields bordered the camp. For months, he'd received POW crews from dawn till dusk. They were efficient, polite, and grateful. Nothing like the monsters he'd imagined. He had seen their quiet dignity, their exhaustion, and above all, their longing for home. He too had sons, one fighting in France, another training for the Pacific, and on that night the thought struck him like a truth he could not ignore. These men were sons too. So when the guard's truck stopped by his gate to collect the prisoners earlier that afternoon, he had done something unusual. He spoke softly to the sergeant in charge, a man he'd come to know by name. The words were simple, hesitant, but clear. "Tomorrow's Christmas. Would it be allowed if I shared supper with them?" The sergeant hesitated. The regulations were strict. No fraternization, no personal invitations. But this was a remote branch camp. There would be no reporters, no officers checking the gate that night. And perhaps the sergeant, too, had felt the weight of the season. "I can't order it," he said quietly, "but I won't stop it." And that was enough. When darkness fell, the farmhouse glowed like a lantern against the empty field. The family set extra chairs at the table, plain wooden ones brought from the barn. The smell of cornbread and roasted chicken filled the room. At the edge of the property, two guards stood by a truck with rifles slung loosely over their shoulders. They watched as 4 German prisoners stepped hesitantly through the gate. Their uniforms were worn but clean, their boots dusted white from frost. They paused at the porch, unsure if they were truly welcome. Then the farmer's wife opened the door. "Come in," she said softly. They removed their caps as they would entering any home. Inside, the warmth hit them like a memory. They stood awkwardly, unsure whether to sit. The farmer gestured gently. "Please," he said. "Eat, no speeches, no ceremony. Only silence, the kind that says more than words ever could." The table was modest but generous. Bread, beans, a roast, coffee, butter, even pie. The Germans bowed their heads as the farmer said grace. They could not understand every word, but they understood the meaning. Gratitude, not victory. One of the prisoners, a young man from Bavaria, wept quietly as he ate. He hadn't tasted homemade food since 1942. Another murmured danke, again and again, as if the word itself was a prayer. The farmer's children watched in wide-eyed wonder. To them, the enemy was no longer a story in newsreels. He was sitting at their table, hungry, polite, and human. When the meal ended, no one wanted to move. The prisoners looked around as if trying to fix every detail in memory. The creak of the chairs, the scent of wood smoke, the way the lamp flickered on the wall. Then, without prompting, one of them reached for his harmonica and began to play. It was the same song heard earlier that evening behind the wire, Silent Night. This time the farmer's wife joined softly in English. 2 languages, 1 melody. Even the guards outside heard it drift into the cold air and said nothing. When the Germans returned to camp that night, the barracks were dark. They slipped back into their cots, carrying no food, no contraband, only the memory of warmth. Word spread quietly the next morning. The men spoke of the house, the family, the meal. Some smiled, others fell silent, staring at the frost on the window. And for the first time since their capture, many of them realized they were no longer enemies. They were simply men, waiting for the war to end. By dawn, the air was sharp with frost. The American flag above the camp gate hung motionless. Inside, the Germans moved through their routine. Roll call, breakfast, inspection. But the rhythm had changed. The barracks were unusually quiet. It wasn't fatigue or punishment. It was something else. Reflection. The men who had gone to the farmhouse the night before were different now. They spoke little, but when they did, it was careful, almost reverent. They described the table, the warmth, the children, the prayer, every detail with the precision of soldiers recounting a battle. Except this time, the battle had been for the soul. At first, the others listened in disbelief, then envy, then silence, because deep down every prisoner knew what that meal meant. It wasn't food that mattered. It was recognition, proof that the world still contained decency, that not all enemies were cruel. For months, the camp had been a place of survival. Eat, work, sleep, obey. But now, for the first time, the prisoners began to remember themselves as men, as fathers, husbands. Sons to Corporal from Bremen later wrote in a diary recovered years after the war, "That night one farmer fed us as if we were his own. I could not eat for tears. I thought of my wife and the ruins of home. I did not feel like a soldier anymore, only human." Word of the incident reached the American guards within hours. The 2 who had stood outside the farmhouse said nothing in their official reports, only that all prisoners returned safely, without incident. But rumors moved faster than paperwork. In the officers' quarters there was debate. Technically, the farmer had broken regulations. Technically, the sergeant had failed to enforce them. But when the camp commander read the account, he reportedly set the file aside and said, "Leave it." Perhaps he understood that in the vast machinery of war, some acts of disobedience served a higher order. The next Sunday, the camp chaplain delivered a sermon that no one had requested. He spoke about the meaning of Christmas, and not as triumph, but as mercy. The prisoners sat quietly. Some bowed their heads, others stared at the floor. Later that day, a curious thing happened. During the evening roll call, after the names were read, a single voice from the ranks began to sing, "Leise rieselt der Schnee," a German carol about snow falling softly. Another voice joined, then another. Soon the entire formation was humming. The guards did not stop them. No one shouted. No one moved. Even the wind seemed to listen. Over the next weeks, small changes spread through the camp. Guards who once barked orders now spoke more evenly. Work crews shared tools without hesitation. When letters arrived from home, often filled with fear and news of bombing raids, Americans offered envelopes or writing paper to reply. It was subtle, unspoken but undeniable. A shift in atmosphere, from enforcement to coexistence. A Red Cross inspector visiting in early January noted in his report that morale appears unusually calm and cooperative. He could not have known the reason. To the men inside the wire, that calmness had a name: a memory of 4 prisoners invited to dinner on Christmas Eve. One evening, weeks later, the farmer drove past the camp again. He slowed near the fence, tipping his hat toward the guard tower. A few prisoners nearby recognized the truck. They waved discreetly. He didn't stop, didn't speak. He simply nodded once, the same gesture he had given them in the field months before. The guards saw but said nothing. By then, they all understood. The silence that followed wasn't tension, it was reverence. A kind of truce had formed, invisible but real. In the long ledger of the war, it would never be recorded. There would be no medal, no headline. But among those who lived it, the story passed quietly from man to man, from camp to camp, told in fragments whispered over years, each retelling proof that even amid a world at war, humanity had not been erased. And when the war finally ended, when the wire came down and ships began to carry the prisoners home, many of those men would remember that night above all others. Not the battles they had fought, not the orders they had followed, but the sound of silent night sung across a table, and the feeling that for a brief moment enemies had remembered what it meant to be human. By May 1945, the guns of Europe had fallen silent. Germany lay in ruins. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden were piles of ash. Millions were displaced. And across the Atlantic, in the quiet corners of America, tens of thousands of German prisoners waited behind fences that no longer had meaning. The war was over, yet they were still captives. The U.S. government now faced the vast logistical task of repatriation. More than 370,000 German POWs remained in America, and transport ships were scarce. The first to leave were the sick, the officers, the long-serving veterans. The rest waited through summer and autumn, restless and uncertain, but the mood had changed. No longer enemies, they were now guests in a country that had shown them mercy. In many camps, farewell ceremonies emerged spontaneously. Prisoners built small wooden crosses, carved names into benches, and painted murals on barrack walls. At Camp Swift, Texas, they erected a sign in English, "We will not forget your kindness." American guards shook hands with men they had once watched through rifle scopes. Some exchanged addresses, others traded photographs. A few even promised to visit, and decades later some would. The repatriation ships sailed from New York, Boston, and New Orleans. Each carried men who looked back at the Statue of Liberty, not as a symbol of the enemy, but as a reminder of something they had experienced but could barely explain: freedom without fear. When they arrived in Europe, the contrast was brutal. Germany was shattered. Railways destroyed, food scarce, cities hollowed. Families were missing or gone. The homeland they had imagined through years of captivity was unrecognizable. And yet, the men who had been prisoners in America found themselves strangely equipped to rebuild it. Many had learned English, studied democracy, or been exposed to a society that valued individual responsibility. For them, captivity had become education. Historians would later note that the German POW experience in America quietly influenced the democratic spirit of post-war West Germany. Former prisoners wrote articles, taught students, and entered politics, carrying the conviction that strength without humanity led only to ruin. A Bavarian farmer named Friedrich Meyer, who had worked in a Texas cotton field, later told a journalist in 1956, "I learned more about freedom behind American wire than I ever did in Hitler's army." The memory of kindness did not fade. Letters continued to cross the Atlantic for years. American families received Christmas cards written in halting English. "We remember your food and your goodness." Some POWs sent packages of handmade gifts, carved from the wood of their old barracks. In a few remarkable cases, reunions occurred. Former prisoners returned to America as visitors, no longer under guard, but as friends. One Texas family recounted that, in 1963, a man arrived unannounced at their gate, speaking careful English. "I worked here." 1944. "You give us dinner." He had traveled from Germany just to say thank you. That night, they ate together again, this time without fences, without uniforms, without fear. The U.S. government officially closed its POW program in 1946. The last German prisoners boarded ships under calm gray skies, their camps dismantled or converted into schools, factories, and fairgrounds. For most Americans, the episode faded into history, overshadowed by victory parades, atomic headlines, and the dawning Cold War. But for those who had lived near the camps, the memory lingered. In towns like Herne, Hereford, and Aliceville, locals remembered the German boys who sang in the fields, fixed their barns, and smiled with gratitude. Some even kept photographs, the faces of former enemies who had once picked their cotton or shared their bread. In official records, nothing was said of the dinner. But among those who knew, it became quiet legend, a moment when the war had paused, not by treaty, not by command, but by compassion. When the last transport ships left American shores in 1946, the war was truly over, but the memory of captivity remained alive in both directions. In Germany, those who had been prisoners in America became quiet ambassadors of a different kind of victory. They returned to ruins, but carried within them the model of a nation that had conquered without hatred. For many, the experience was transformative. The Nazi regime had preached that mercy was weakness, that compassion was betrayal. Yet behind barbed wire in the United States, these men had lived under guards who were firm but fair, who shared cigarettes and music, who treated even defeated soldiers with dignity. That contrast could not be unseen. In post-war West Germany, as democracy took root, countless civic leaders, teachers, and local officials were former POWs who had spent years in American camps. They became in subtle ways transmitters of the values they had witnessed. Fairness, dialogue, restraint. In interviews decades later, some described it as re-education by example. No lectures, no pamphlets, just the quiet observation of decency in practice. One former prisoner wrote, "America showed me that victory need not be cruel. I learned that strength comes from self-control, not domination." Meanwhile, in the United States, the memory of the POW camps faded from public consciousness, but not from the hearts of those who had lived near them. In the 1950s and 60s, former farmers, guards, and camp staff would gather in small town halls to reminisce. They remembered the long workdays, the harvests saved, the songs sung across the fields. Most spoke of the prisoners not as enemies, but as the boys. And when asked why they had treated them so well, the answer was always the same: because it was the right thing to do. It was a simple truth, one that had sustained a moral balance during the most violent century in history. The physical traces of the camps vanished slowly. Fences were torn down, barracks dismantled. Some campsites became schools or grain silos. Others disappeared into farmland. Only faint depressions in the soil marked where the watchtowers once stood. But beneath the surface, the legacy endured, not as shame or pride, but as memory. Local museums would later uncover carvings, sketches, and journals left behind by prisoners. One diary from a Texas camp included the words, "They invited us to dinner. That night I began to believe again in mankind." Such artifacts revealed something larger: that kindness, once offered, does not vanish. It becomes part of the record of civilization, as vital as any treaty or battle. In the broader story of the Second World War, the episode might seem small. It changed no maps, won no medals, and ended no battles. But history, in its quieter moments, often hides its deepest truths. The dinner in that Texas farmhouse, one among many acts of compassion scattered across the continent, proved that even amid total war, humanity could survive the machinery of hatred. When historians later revisited the American POW program, they noted its singular distinction. Not one documented case of deliberate cruelty toward German prisoners in the United States. In a global conflict defined by atrocity, that record stands almost alone. The farmer's table became a symbol, not of forgiveness, but of moral clarity. It asked no favor, demanded no return. It simply refused to let war dictate the boundaries of decency. In 1995, during the 50th anniversary of the war's end, a small memorial was dedicated near the site of one former POW camp in Texas. Among the attendees were aging veterans, former guards, local families, and a few Germans who had returned as old men. They stood together under the open sky, listening as a choir sang Silent Night, the same melody that had drifted through the wire half a century earlier. When the song ended, no one spoke. There was only stillness, the same kind of silence that had fallen over the camp on that night in 1944, a silence not of fear, but of peace remembered. In the great archives of war, history remembers the noise and the thunder of artillery, the roar of bombers, the cries of victory and surrender. But sometimes what endures is the silence that follows. The night an American farmer invited his prisoners to dinner was not recorded in official reports or battlefield maps. It left no medals, no headlines, no grand declarations. And yet it carried the quiet weight of everything the war had nearly destroyed. Empathy, humility, the simple grace of seeing another person not as an enemy, but as human. For those men, German and American alike, that single act became a memory that survived longer than any flag. It was proof that decency could exist even inside a system built to divide, that the hardest walls of war were not made of barbed wire, but of fear. History often defines victory in terms of power, but moral victory is different. It comes not from conquest but from restraint, from the decision to remain kind when no one demands it. That night in Texas, kindness was not strategy or propaganda. It was instinct. one man's refusal to let the world's madness define him. And in doing so, he reminded both sides of something the war had nearly erased, that compassion is stronger than ideology. When the prisoners sailed home, they carried that lesson with them. When the farmer grew old, he never spoke of what he'd done, and yet the silence he created, the silence of understanding, outlasted the war itself. Because peace is not only the absence of conflict, it is the presence of humanity. And sometimes all it takes to begin it is a meal shared across a table between men who were once enemies.